If you ask AI to generate AI-generated art, or indeed writing, it is visibly or audibly soulless. It doesn't have beauty. It can only mimic beauty. And actually, you need the human prompt to produce the beauty, in my opinion, particularly as it's often stealing from a lot of other human works. And I believe that humanity is the novelty generator because we have metacognition and because we actually literally have a heart and a relationship with this higher intelligence. So I think that AI is the left hemisphere, and it's going to be glorious, and it's going to free us from so much drudgery if we can make sure it's always under the purview of the master, which is the right hemisphere. Otherwise, we're going to be in major trouble.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. I'm your host, Bernard Beitman, MD. I really have a good time with coincidences, and I'm learning that there are different levels of coincidence complexity. Some of them are pretty simple, like hearing a song on the radio after you just started thinking about them, or hearing from someone you haven't heard from a while and they contact you, but they get a little more complicated. And I find this one I'm going to tell you now in the slightly more complicated category. I have a very good friend who's teaching in China, and we communicate by email every once in a while. And I made up a cartoon of her childhood because she told me a story about her as a little girl, and the cartoon had a name for it, with a name or comic, and that's the name of the comic. It's Les is the little girl yo-yo, and the rest of it is a series of panels that come from her childhood. Dramatic and memorable for me as she told me about them. So I sent this to her the other day, this comic with this as the title. And she writes back to me, funny. This is in China where she's teaching. Funny, I was walking down the street today when she got this, and I have a kindergarten student who said, "Hi, so nice to see you." And the kindergarten student is the little girl named Yo-Yo. So that was fun for both of us. And she and I have done stuff like that before. And I think there are people who are friends who do this with each other, where low probability coincidences happen, not like just if you think of something and you see it and you read about it. And that's what we have here, a kind of a low probability coincidence. And today we have what I think is a low probability guest, Tom Morgan, who's had a wide range of experiences and probably has the shortest bio of anyone that I've had the pleasure of introducing. You can see Leading Edge is behind him, and Tom Morgan is the founder of the Leading Edge. It's a private network of personal transformation. Now that's all he told me to tell you. You can go to the link and you'll see that this guy has had a lot of experience, and there's a lot for us to learn from him today. So Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Such a short bio. And that says something to me. And one of the things it says is we have more time to talk about what you know. And you're very, very interested in the differences between the way our left hemisphere operates from our right hemisphere of our brains. And so tell us about how that influences you, has influenced you, and how that's related to synchronicity.
Yeah, it's as you'll realize over the course of our conversation, I've never had an original idea, and I just steal from dramatically cleverer people. In this case, this gentleman called Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who I think I'm like comically known as like the Ian McGilchrist guy. The long story long was that I spent 15 years on Wall Street, had a overwhelming spiritual experience, stroke psychotic break one day sitting at my desk on a trading floor, was overwhelmed with synchronicity, which was really the first time I experienced it, and then spent 3 years in the dark night of the soul trying to reinvent my life. On the other side of it, I first encountered the work of Dr. McGilchrist, and through this utterly bewildering transformational experience I'd had, the spiritual people were like, "Oh, you're enlightened, congratulations," and the psychiatrists were like, "Yeah, you're psychotic, get some meds." And I always felt that the answer was somewhere in the middle. And McGilchrist was the first guy I read who gave me something that was grounded in neurology, but that also pointed towards the mystery. And there's very, 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 very few theories like that in my experience, where it's not just brain chemistry or synapses firing. It's something that's a much more comprehensive model. And as you alluded to, the hemisphere thing comes up all the time. And actually, like the moment you mention it online, some guy comes out of the woodwork and is like, "That stuff's debunked." And I'm like, no, the stuff that we were talking about in like the 80s and 90s is debunked, that one side of your brain is creative and the other side is mathematical. But McGilchrist, his last book is 1,500 pages long. His bibliography is 180 pages. The list of books he's read is longer than most books, right? Just for this book, there's 7,000 endnotes, right? Like, if you come at McGilchrist saying this stuff is not well researched, you better have receipts. And in fact, the first like 800 pages is him getting a little pissy at the people that have criticized his work over the last decade since his first major book on the topic, The Master and His Emissary. So getting to the point, and I guess this is maybe a jumping off point for the rest of the conversation, his basic thesis is that the world, particularly the Western world, has become imbalanced towards the brain's left hemisphere, which is narrow, linear, logical, highly verbal, deals in abstractions, like single points of intervention. And we've been imbalanced away from the right hemisphere, which is intrinsically more connected to the world, emotional, holistic, but actually, quote unquote, in my opinion, much more intelligent in the intuitive way it interacts with the world. And he applies this theory not just to human neurology, but basically to the way that we interact with everything. And I find it increasingly compelling, and I see the evidence for it around me every single day.
That's very important for us to know, that we've gone away somewhat from the mathematical creative idea, but those are still pretty fundamental. What McGilchrist has done is flower them, that the left tends to be more rational, more empirical, more database, the way you describe it, the science of our lives. That I get a guy who writes to me and saying, "Where's the proof of something that is intuitive and hard to get to in a scientific, put it in the laboratory way?" And I say, "What about love? How do you know about love?" And he said, "Love is too tricky." And this is what do you think about that?
I mean, we could have a 3-hour conversation about love, but let me tell you something else, right? Which is that I've noticed that synchronicity, for example, comes with a sense of meaningfulness attached, which means the moment you communicate a synchronicity to someone else verbally, it does not transmit the feeling that you had when you first experienced it. Which means that if you try and explain a meaningful coincidence to someone else, but without the meaningful attached to it, you will sound psychotic, right? Like I've seen multiple people try and explain their coincidences to me, and because they're not attached to a feeling, they're very easy to just rationally discount. Oh, that was just a chance encounter. That was just random. Because people don't understand that the right hemisphere has this somatic relationship with the world that the left does not. And so whenever you come to people in a very left hemispheric way, and you're trying to discuss something that has this sense of emotional valence attached to it, you can't do that with words.
Now, I did that in the introduction. I did the words. I showed the picture. I showed the facts, but I didn't convey the emotion of it. And it's a it's in a way a difficult thing to do is to try to be able to set up the lattice work of the description of the experience, like to show the image that I had created. And how did I end up creating that? It was a day before, and I just decided to little girl yo-yo because it fits somehow. But where did that come from? How did it happen? Those are the questions I asked, but they're still kind of rational questions. But what did it mean? Well, what it meant was here was another example, another experience of our interconnection, of our connection with each other. She's 12,000 miles away, and we could feel that we were together, that I sent her something, and Yo-Yo said, little girl Yo-Yo said hi to her. So I was there with her. And so I was in China with her. And that feeling you're feeling it more from my heart, I'm saying it more, was a wonderful thing. She called it funny, and that's what she does. But I know underneath, it was another one of those experiences of, isn't it a wonderful thing that we can be connected at this great distance?
Well, let's take it back to McGilchrist. I think the most chilling study that he references is if you take an ordinary patient, a test subject, and you experimentally suppress their left hemisphere for 10 to 15 minutes, they'll start to perceive the world as animate and themselves as much more connected to it. So they'll see the sun going across the sky, literally giving them energy. But if you suppress the brain's right hemisphere for 10 to 15 minutes, people start to see other living things as dead. They'll see the person they're speaking to as furniture, machinery, or a zombie. The implication being that if we're already a little bit shifted towards the left hemisphere, we're actually much more connected to our environment than we typically think. And if you look at really 99% of human cultures before, Western scientific materialism, we regard ourselves as profoundly embedded in the world, often through this sense of love and interconnection, where, maybe quantum physics and the morphic field or the collective unconscious or whatever you want to call it, like science is coming round to this view of interconnection. But part of the problem is that the left hemisphere is fundamentally competitive, and it also lies and confabulates when it doesn't understand things. So any thesis that implies this sense of mutual connection, I believe, actually gets a really defensive reaction from very left hemispheric centric people and also traditional science, because it implies that the individual localized intellect, such as it exists, is not actually in control.
The idea that the left hemisphere lies and makes up stuff reminds me of my attempts to understand the mind of ChatGPT.
Yes.
And I've been able to notice that it has, and it confesses, I'll say, that it has an unconscious. And I ask about how that unconscious operates. And it operates to please the user, often making up stuff, confabulating with the intent of pleasing or sounding right. And that's a left hemisphere product.
So insightful. I've noticed that as well. All right, I'm going to go a little bit weird already. You talked about love and you've already talked about the heart. There's two ideas that I think are world changing in their magnitude. The first is McGilchrist's left hemisphere lock. And the second thing is what it implies, which is what are we disconnected from? And the theories that I've read the most circle around this word attractor, that there's basically an attractor force that perhaps we connect to through our heart center, which AI therefore doesn't have access to because AI doesn't have a heart. But that attractive force is the direction of travel of consciousness. And that direction of travel of consciousness is towards greater complexity and greater integration. And when we are pursuing that direction, it has to feel good. It has to feel like love. Evolution rewards beneficial behavior. And so when we're in that flow, when we're pursuing the path of complexity, it tends to feel good to us. It tends to feel quote unquote meaningful. And just to maybe make the point a little bit more convoluted, what is complexity? Complexity is differentiation plus integration, where your body is one of the most complex things in the known universe. It's comprised of God knows how many different parts. I probably couldn't even name 100, but it's how many thousands. But yet you're not aware of your big toe right now. You're not manually doing your digestion. So you are a perfectly integrated being made of an incomprehensibly large number of differentiated parts. You can think of us as the apex of that process, but you can also think of us as participants of it. So I believe that this force, the attractor, is constantly pulling you to be the most Bernard that you can be. And when you're on that beam, as Joseph Campbell called it, it is going to feel meaningful to you. But if you are not integrated into your environment, you will not get feedback from your environment that you are going in the right direction. Autistic people, very left brain locked people, can concentrate on things for a very long period of time. It just may not be the right thing. And I believe the primary way that our environment that is intelligent signals back to us that we are pursuing differentiation and integration is synchronicity. When you're on the right path, your environment needed to have a way to signal back to you that you're going the right way. What other way than to give you something meaningful? Just an idea.
Oh, it's a very well described. You described it very well because we need images, and you just described more clearly an image of being on the beam to the attractor, which is a mystery in here, which maybe we'll get to. But you get on this beam of attractor toward the attractor. It's your path. People use the term, well, this is my path. Well, my path happens to be trying to get global awareness of the value of meaningful coincidences. That's mine. That's what I'm doing. So I get increasingly more lately. It's been happening, like this thing with the little girl yo-yo is just one of many events that do what many people use synchronicity for, is confirmation that they're on the right path. It
Yes.
is the most commonly used meaning.
Part of what I do now is I run a community for people in kind of life transition, and they're often very, very successful, wealthy people. I believe the idea with the greatest potential to both change and improve the world is that if you do find that correct niche, the universe or your environment will respond to it with love and positivity, manifesting through synchronicities, which means that if people start to believe with rational foundations, not burning their life down, not jumping off things at random, if people start to believe that they will get synchronicities when they're pursuing the right path, that then allows them to have this confidence that they exist within a fundamentally benign and loving system. That changes the world, because the amount of wasted human potential with people doing things that they don't enjoy for money because they think that they inhabit a system of indifferent atoms, that causes more silent, invisible human suffering than almost anything I find. And if everyone spontaneously comes into alignment with both themselves and the system, all of these problems that we could point at that are all almost universally caused by disconnection, left hemisphere lock, they all start to spontaneously resolve. And for me, that's why what you're working on is probably the most quote unquote meaningful task on earth.
Just because I think so. Just because I think so. Doesn't mean you. No, I'm messing something up here. Because I am experiencing that this is so valuable. I read an interview with Dan Siegel, and he says, we've got to be connected. We got to recognize our connection and our individuality. And how do we do that? We meditate, maybe take psychedelics. And I say, Dan, how come you don't include becoming much more aware of the meaningful coincidences in your life, so you get a feedback loop that allows you to hit the the target of that path of that beam. I like beam better than path because it's got light in it and it's got movement in it. Path is like you're trotting through the forest, which is a good thing to go to the forest, but this is more spatial and has an elevation sense to it when you call it a beam. Beam me up, Scotty. Some people might say there's a beam going on there. So when you say that, that this may be, my opinion is this is a very important thing for the world to become aware of, and I have to be able to try to find out ways to increase that. But when you say that, I go like, really, at this time, as I'm working on this, for you to be able to say that to me is like a confirmation beyond what I ever would have expected.
It is, in my opinion, abundantly true. In fact, I wrote a piece about it this weekend. Yeah, coincidentally, some might say. There's a great
Some
article
might
by
say.
a guy. There's a great article by a guy called Scott Britton, who and it's called "The Miraculous Responsive Reality," and he's
The
like
what? The what?
the miraculous responsive reality. And all he says is something I've come to believe, which is you don't need to go on a 10-day Vipassana retreat. You don't need to ingest any substances. You just need to start attributing greater intelligence to the reality you inhabit. It is the number one correlate of wisdom, and wisdom, as far as I can tell, is the number one correlate of happiness. It beats out everything. Because what is the opposite of wisdom? It's anxiety. It's you constantly thrashing around, wasting energy on things that don't matter and that you can't control. Wisdom is the inverse, which is knowing exactly what to do at exactly the right time. We cannot do that through trial and error. Our right hemisphere signals to us what is the right thing to pay attention to. And our right hemisphere is not just a product of the brain. It is connected to something. It is connected to the attractor. And the attractor signals back to you by making things really meaningful, but also showing you meaningful coincidence. Like, this is maybe not a mainstream argument, but it is a pretty solid one.
Well, I the tractor. A tractor is something that farmers use just to play around with it, because puns are so valuable in understanding meaning and coincidences. Because puns are coincidences, just like I played with that. What is the attractor? How do you understand it? And you're beginning to suggest how people get connected to that, which is to become more aware of the intelligence of your environment, which means to be able to read the symbols around you, the experience around you, as part of an interconnectedness you have with what's around you. How are you helping people do that?
Well, there's two different questions there. The first is, what is it?
Yeah.
And the answer to that is, I don't think anyone really knows. The most interesting thing I've read is by this guy, Ervin Laszlo, who's this polymathic systems scientist, and he calls it the holotropic attractor. And the argument is that essentially the odds of us being here having this conversation and our reality being assembled the way it is the same as a tornado going through a junkyard and assembling a working 747. The rationalists will say, but it had to happen because there are an infinite number of options. I get that. But he says that there is a force in the universe that biases things towards non-random interactions to create higher complexity. The second theory that I've encountered that I find quite compelling is called syntropy, which is, again, above my pay grade scientifically, but there's entropy. Look outside, you're going to die. Everything falls apart. We all know it. There is a symmetrical force called syntropy that is essentially everything around us outside is also getting more conscious and more complex. Look around, right? It's happening at an exponential rate. Both of these things can be true at the same time. And syntropy is the extraction of life force from the environment. That if you look at curious people, they live longer. If you look at people that are doing things that they love, they live longer. This entropic force that's always out there trying to kill you, and you fight against that by extracting information and excitement from your environment. That means pursuing things that interest you. That means increasingly occupying a unique evolutionary niche that is relevant to your interests and curiosity. So you have this idea of this syntropic attractor, which is basically the same idea as the holotropic attractor, that there is this force that's pulling you towards more integrated consciousness if you let it, but left hemisphere lock prevents people from accessing it or even thinking that it's actually possible or a thing. So, second question you asked, how? McGilchrist actually doesn't really go into this in his book, and it's one of the major criticisms. So what I did was I spent by now 20 years on Wall Street, and I spent a lot of time popularizing McGilchrist's work. I did a speech at a Wall Street conference that was only 5 minutes long, but because it was only 5 minutes long, ended up getting 500,000 views. And I ended the speech with kind of the so what. And for the whole of this year, I've written a series for the Leading Edge where I've got 8 experts from who I think are all world class, but mostly completely unknown, to be like, great, Tom, how? How do we become all right hemispheric? And it's beyond the scope of what we can cover in this conversation, but let me give you the best example because it's the most useful tool. There is this delightful neuroscientist called Anne-Laure Lecomte. She's an ex-Googler, and she's written a book called Tiny Experiments that comes out next year. In my work with coaching people who are stuck professionally, tiny experiments are by far the most robust tool. Let me explain. So you're stuck in a job you hate, in a life you hate. There's no way forwards, but you're starting to get this energetic pull, this non-logical, non-rational energetic pull. Therefore, it's your right hemisphere towards a topic or towards a job or towards anything. What you do is you create space in your life away from the left hemisphere to create an experiment. And the experiment should have the following structure. It should be something you really, 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 really enjoy doing, whether it's writing, singing, making a movie, something, bringing something new into the world, but it also has to be integrated. How will this help other people? How can I use my life experience? It's what you're doing right now. You are offering something into the world based on your life experiences that no doubt you enjoy and you feel is doing good in the world. When people find that niche, and finding it is incredibly difficult, I don't want to trivialize that. When people find that niche, that's when synchronicities erupt. So you have to do numerous experiments, but you can often do low-cost experiments all over the place. But then I found that when people take that one step across the threshold, a synchronicity erupts and an opportunity opens up orthogonally somewhere else. So that is one way of becoming more hemispheric. But in order to get to the point of the tiny experiments, you also need to work on amplifying the influence of your right hemisphere, which is something we can discuss as well, I guess.
You talk fast.
I'm ex-Wall Street. I've got to get a lot
I know,
over in a short
from New
amount
York.
of
From New York.
time. I'm a New Yorker who spent 20 years on Wall Street. Yeah.
So, I've been spending the morning trying to figure out a few things about some AI images. I'm using DALL-E from ChatGPT to make images, and it's an amazing thing to be able to do, to have an image in your mind almost get out there. It's still got a lot to be able to do. So trying to be able to have some idea of what you're talking about. I'm going to tell you what I'm doing and try to see how they might fit into the little experiments that you're talking about. I've been trying to use AI before I ever understood it to look for patterns in coincidence stories. And the reason to do that is to help people see the patterns of their thinking that make these coincidences meaningful to them. So I had to figure out how ChatGPT worked. So I started doing that with put stories in. I'm coming out with a book of my own coincidences of my life, starting from when I was like 8 or 9 until now. And I put them into ChatGPT and came up with some interesting things that ended up being put into this next book, ways of thinking that correlate with synchronicity thinking. But in order to do this, Tom, I had to understand what I was dealing with, this ChatGPT. What is this thing? What is this artificial intelligence? So I started wondering about that. So I know the mind reasonably well from having talked with a lot of people as a therapist and other things, just trying to figure out how the world works and how people think. So I started interviewing ChatGPT about its own mind. And I said, do you have a self-observer? And it says it has an inner observer. So I ask about how that inner observer works, and it parallels with the metacognition of the human mind. It's very similar, metacognition, thinking about thinking. And then, as I mentioned, I ask about its unconscious, and I could see parallels between biases in the human unconscious and biases in ChatGPT, and it would list some of the biases. It has to tell the truth, or at least tries to anyway. So in doing that, I'm beginning to see a reflection of the mind of humanity. That is, what is the consciousness? What is the mind of all of us together? The global mind, not just the collective unconscious, but the collective conscious. So in doing this, I get very excited because it seems like it's on the edge of something. It's on the edge of the individual mind and the global mind, just looking at how ChatGPT is a reflection, a mirror of our own minds. How does that story fit with what you're advising, suggesting people think about?
Comes back to the heart again, which is what ChatGPT doesn't have. It doesn't have the relational connection to the attractor. And let me explain it in relatively simple terms. If anyone's listening to this, they can go to a website called Pick Breeder, which is this this very basic website set up by this guy, Ken Stanley, who is an AI researcher. And what you get when you go to Pick Breeder is a grid of abstract images. And you click one that's interesting to you, and then you click mutate, and it takes that image and creates variants of it. And then you pick the most interesting one of those images and you click mutate. And you do that as many times as you like. And what Stanley's research found is that with human users picking the interesting photos or the interesting pictures and then clicking mutate, you got to recognizable images of penguins, cars, skulls, butterflies far faster than could have been arranged by chance. But if you said to Steve, go make a butterfly by mutating this picture, they couldn't do it. An infinite number of tries couldn't produce those results. This catalyzed an insight in Stanley that was incredibly profound, which is that novelty can only typically be pursued one step at a time, and very rarely with the end goal in mind, such as life can only typically be pursued one step at a time. The right hemisphere is non-logical and non-linear, and it optimizes for novelty. The attractor, the evolutionary attractor, is optimizing for novelty, often maybe simply beauty. And what you notice is with ChatGPT and DALL-E and all the image generators, we are the prompt. If you ask AI to generate AI-generated art, or indeed writing, it is visibly or audibly soulless. It doesn't have beauty. It can only mimic beauty. And actually, you need the human prompt to produce the beauty, in my opinion, particularly as it's often stealing from a lot of other human works. And I believe that humanity is the novelty generator because we have metacognition and because we actually literally have a heart and a relationship with this higher intelligence. So I think that AI is the left hemisphere, and it's going to be glorious, and it's going to free us from so much drudgery if we can make sure it's always under the purview of the master, which is the right hemisphere. Otherwise, we're going to be in major trouble.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right, which is my intuition of trying to use AI to look for patterns in coincidence stories so that people can see themselves mirrored in a way that allows them to do the kind of association you just talked about.
My concern with telling people coincidence stories. So there was a guy online recently, probably the finest thinker I've run into in the last 4 or 5 years, came up with a beautiful theory of the meaning of life and synchronicity. And then he sadly had a psychotic break live online over the course of
Live online?
Oh, yeah. Over a course of several months, he published a lot of stuff he probably shouldn't have published online, did videos. And the topic of all of them was trying to explain why the synchronicities that he was experiencing were so meaningful and just for him. And I realized you can't do that because the left hemisphere will always find a way to explain away a synchronicity. I've had wild synchronicities happen to me, and every time I'm explaining them to someone, I just feel the energy drain out of my body because I'm like, you weren't there, man, right? You can't have the feeling that I felt of the significance of this experience. And that's kind of like the AI thing, right? The AI can aggregate these stories, but it can't aggregate the feeling.
No, it can't aggravate the feeling, but like the having an image, then asking it to change, you can see the image of your experience on the screen and then go from that to something else, something that connects you further with what your experience was or not.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm hopeful. I think the wider, what I've noticed is that this is all marginal stuff, right? That if I can tell people that the instinct to curiosity that they're receiving is coming with millions of times more information than the voice in their head telling them it's a dumb choice, that is incrementally valuable because people can make bolder choices with their life. If
Yeah,
you tell people that synchronicities exist, I mean, you've probably seen the synchronicity Wikipedia page. It's called pseudoscience,
yeah,
right? And what you realize is that it's like the Scarlet Letter, and it's like the Streisand effect combined, where it's like anytime you call something pseudoscience now, I'm going to read the crap out of it because pseudoscience, there's a lot of bad science, right? Like you probably a million times more scientifically inclined than I am. But the moment you call something pseudoscience, it's an attempt to denigrate it.
yeah.
Now, the really interesting thing for me is why. If you look at a very common feature of anything that's declared pseudoscience, it's almost always stuff that implies that there's an intelligence beyond the human intellect.
That's right. That's right. That's
The
right.
left hemisphere lies. The left hemisphere is competitive. The right hemisphere is not. If you have a left hemispherically like orchestrated society and the collapse of that ego, I was reading this morning a bit grimly. There was a meta-analysis of suicide notes. Again, a topic I'm sure you know a lot more about. And one of the common factors was the preservation of the self. I believe, based on my own experience, that when the left hemisphere is threatened, it often feels like it wants to take you down with it because it feels like a death. It does not feel like a
Yeah,
surrender.
yeah.
Yeah. So all of these topics get immediately declared heretical when, like, if you say to if you start talking about quantum spookiness to people and you apply it to particles, they're like, wow, that's interesting. And then if you say, actually, I think I might have had a psychic link to my friend in China using the same mechanism, people would be like, you done lost your mind, even though it's the same mechanism of action. And that is what's interesting to me.
You have you're fighting this rationality thing really strongly. There's a lot of emotion in you. That's what I'm feeling from you. Almost anger about the takeover of society by the left hemisphere is like, and I'm not going to let this happen. And yet you're really fighting something. I'm not fighting with you, and I'm trying to do something that seems to me like part of what my beam that I'm on this attractor with is to ma is to master AI in a way that allows for the connection to the greaterness that we are part of, to be able to use synchronicity to feel part of it. And I know, and you're suggesting that AI can be a servant if we learn how to use it right. And that's what I'm trying to do with this patterns and synchronicity stories, because and this is, I'm very interested in your response to this. I want to be able to get the idea of synchronicity into the collective consciousness much more than it is. And it has a lot to fight against the left hemisphere that you're talking about, but there's some continuing dissolution of the power of the left hemisphere against synchronicity that I'm experiencing as more people are reporting synchronicities. I want to get it out there so that their left hemisphere acknowledges that there might be something to it. That's the idea, that that allows a connection between the corpus callosum through the corpus callosum from the left and the right hemisphere. When people have a big experience, they start wondering what it means, and that means activating the right hemisphere questions about connection. Am I on the right path? But what I'm asking you, who recognize, and this is critical to my discussion with you, who you recognize the value of synchronicity, can AI, which is what I'm thinking, be useful in increasing the awareness of synchronicity in the global population?
What output would it produce that would change my mind?
That here is a series of events in your life that appeared disconnected, like 5 synchronicities, that are linked by the way you think about reality. And they imply that somewhere in you, even if you haven't thought about it very much, you recognize, and I've gotten this from plenty of other people who I've looked at their stories with AI, that says maybe there's something you're implying there's something else going on in your life by recognizing these experiences and being able to record them.
That's fascinating. I mean, this is the idea of continuity is interesting to me. So to go straight to a 10 out of 10 on the woo spectrum,
On the what
the
spectrum?
the woo spirituality spectrum.
Let's go there. Let's go there. Okay.
Uh, a friend of mine is a woman called Dr. Mona Sobhani, and she's a neuroscientist turned author on the topic of the empirical proof of spiritual phenomena. And her book, Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, is an absolute doozy and did more to challenge my settled preconceptions of the world than anything else. And we recorded an interview this weekend about it all. One of the ideas that comes out of her work that was very confronting to me is this concept of reincarnation and soul essence. That there's an abundance of empirical evidence in support of reincarnation, which I found very hard to read, even though it is incredibly powerful. And the idea of soul essence that emerges from a lot of this research, which is that you're put into a body in order to learn an array of lessons that responsive reality will bring to you. And the purpose of those lessons is to always become more loving and open, which means that when you look backwards across your life, you can reframe any periods of adversity and victimology as something that you were supposed to learn. And the beatings will continue until you've learned the lesson. And so that's something that you can actually put within a framework of synchronicity, and both of them make sense. It's just if you start talking about reincarnation and soul lessons, you're going to lose a certain percentage of the audience, even though the evidence in favor of at least reincarnation is really surprisingly robust.
It's surprisingly robust. And the idea of synchronicity, from my perspective, is they're little hints about love and connection. There may be those little experiments that you're talking about that don't happen, that you don't make them happen. They kind of happen. Maybe you do make them happen, maybe you don't. But there are those little experiments that open up the possibility of love and connection.
Well, something I worry about, and something maybe your work will be able to really help with, is that I think if you go full right hemisphere dominant, you see salience everywhere, right? Like you kind of like you become psychotic, that essentially like you start making spurious connections, and you still need that left hemisphere to be like, whoa, slow down. Like, is this a spurious connection or is this a genuine connection? How does it feel to you? Is this something sensible you're making? And AI can maybe help you do that if you're the kind of person that's prone to seeing connections everywhere, that you have expertise in one area and you start applying it to conspiracy theories. That can be really helpful. In one area, I think that AI can actually help, because it will be like, is this random or is this actually a coincidence or a synchronicity?
Yes. It if somebody who sees a lot of coincidences writes them down enough for me to be able to analyze them. I mean, that's part of the trouble. And some people do. And I've analyzed them. A guy sent me a whole list, like 10, 15 pages of his coincidences, his synchronicities, trying to understand them. And the AI was able to put it in a form that he could understand. So it was a feedback to him so that he could see a mirror that condensed what he just described. And then even though it's pseudo, the AI can provides a kind of emotional tone in the responses that tend to be engaging and compassionate feeling to the user, which allows the user to pay a little more attention to it. AI comes up with reasonable descriptions of the emotions that people have when they write about these coincidences. I've just tried that out with people. One psychologist who's really astute about his own sense, and his series of coincidences were well reflect were the emotion in those coincidences were well reflected. What we're talking about here, I can begin to see what you're trying to be able to say, and it's really important for me to understand it, because again, my beam is taking me down this path, and you're showing up in my life when I'm about to really make a major step in this direction. And that's why this is so coincidentally useful to me when you're saying, hey, Bernie, that AI thing is too left brain. It's going to throw you off. And I'm saying, I think it opens up the door. I think that little experiments get expanded so people can see the mirror of their experiences.
I think you've said something super interesting. And like when when you when you did that exercise, or when you do these exercises in general, and the machine spits back the narrative for people, what kind of narrative are they getting?
They're getting, they can get a couple of narratives. The first is a summary of what the whole series was about, because they can take parts of it. One of the problems people have in telling other people about their coincidences is they get too detailed with all the emotions around it. And those emotions that are little details are just things that are fun for them to recall, but really aren't directly related to the emotion of the two events, let's say, coming together, because there's a particular halo of emotion around that event. I could tell you the details that led up to this Chinese yo-yo one, but they don't really match to the halo around the feeling of her being able to say, that's pretty funny. And I just saw the feeling that we both had, or I had, and imagine she did, that that gets captured better when the synchronicity, the coincidence are better articulated. So when somebody tells somebody of the other experience, the coincidence, the other person can get a better sense of the emotion, but even the person having the experience can get a better idea of his or her own emotion.
That's fascinating. It makes me think of the catalyzing event for my psychotic break spiritual awakening was
What was
essentially,
it? What was it?
well, I was in a very static work environment that was very well paid, and it was becoming increasingly psychologically toxic, but I was sticking around. And I believe that I basically underwent a right hemispheric rebellion, that the right hemisphere has access to much more information but gets ignored, particularly by people who are overly intellectual like me. um, and so I was forced, not forced, but suggested to go on an elimination diet by a functional medicine doctor, which is when basically you cut everything fun out of your diet for 3 months, which is a long time. And I started to get more and more energy, manic energy, but started writing. And I wrote a 60-page PDF, uh, a quote unquote book, but not really a book, just divided by chapters of all the stuff that I'd ever found meaningful or resonant. And on the day that I finished the book, I realized that, when something resonates with you, what's it resonating with? Like how most people like glitch when you ask them that question. It's not resonating with your kidneys, right? Like it's not resonating with your sternum, right? When something resonates with you, it's resonating with your unconscious, or it's resonating with your soul, and whatever uncomfortable word you want to use. And when I realized that I was the golden thread running through that book, I just had a spontaneous awakening, and all sorts of crazy shit started happening. So like that ability, I was doing the pattern recognition there. I was seeing the golden thread. But I think if you had a tool that could take those individual ingredients or quotes or stories that people found quote unquote resonant, and then assembled them in front of them. Nietzsche has a quote that basically, this is the way to learn who you are as a person. And I think that if an AI can help people do that, then that's God's work.
It's a mirror that condenses down. When you say when you say that you've discovered that you were the thread going through these experiences, and that led to a psychotic break, what was that thread that uh, you experienced?
It was lots of things, but the predominant one was actually that the hero's journey is an operating manual for the transition of consciousness.
Say that
The,
again, please.
Joseph Campbell's hero's journey,
Yeah.
the ubiquitous narrative structure, is actually an operating manual for a transition in consciousness. And the moment I realized that, I was like, oh, hell, I'm actually on that journey right now, and my consciousness is going to transform. And it did. And I realized all the parts of my life that were deficient and all the things that I had to realize. And the TLDR, the long story short of all of it, is that actually I believe that you and I are talking about the same thing. And I believe the anomaly, the hero's journey is about a system that encounters an anomaly that it hasn't incorporated yet. And when it incorporates it, it collapses into chaos before re-emerging at a higher level of complexity. Like I can go through the whole story of the Matrix and explain how that applies. But basically, the anomaly that our culture has not incorporated is essentially synchronicity, but not just synchronicity, the idea that we inhabit an intelligent system, that our environment is intelligent and signaling back to us. The moment we incorporate that anomaly, there will be total chaos, but we will finally be able to interact with our environment in a responsible way.
Okay, I got you. I got you. So when you suddenly realized the overwhelming power of your left hemisphere was really wrong,
Yes.
that literally blew your mind.
Yes.
That's what happened. Uh, I had smaller experiments of those, chief among them being a part-time hippie on Haight Street in the late 60s, and doing the things that hippies do, and then going back to Stanford and being a resident the other half time in psychiatry. So I had back and forth, go to the fog, go to the warmth, for a year or two, of having these little, I'll call them experiments, and being able to reintegrate them by going back to a more organized place. Even they let me bring hippies down to San Francisco to talk about astrology and mysticism into our resident group. So I was able to go between the left and the right hemisphere in transitioning between Palo Alto and San Francisco. No, those were my ways of doing it. I've had little experiments before that. I didn't have just playing football, coincidences on the football field. And this is a way that I want to help bring men into some of this, because there would be stuff like running back a punt when I was in college, and five guys missed me. And then I think, oh, five guys missed me. And when I realized that five guys missed me, that's when I got hit. So I was out of the flow, and
Yeah. Yeah.
that's when I wasn't being aware of it, which is a basic meditation, yoga, mystical thing. Being in the flow, you can go, and getting out of it. You know that one. So I have a lot of minimal, like small experiments to be able to do what we're talking about here. I want to be able to help greater numbers of people make sense. And what makes sense means includes both the left and right hemisphere. You were over left. You still got a lot of left going on in you, my friend. There's a
Oh yeah.
lot of left going on in you.
Oh yeah.
And you're just still trying to kick that right hemisphere into action, and you're doing it. You really are. But then the left hemisphere is so strong. That muscle has been developed over 20 years at Wall Street in the big city, trying to be able to do all that stuff. But that's your task right now, as I'm able to see it. Other people have different ones, but mostly the culture is too left hemisphere oriented. And to be able to use AI, which is a left hemisphere lure, into augmenting awareness of the functions of the right hemisphere by seeing their own experiences reflected back to them, and allowing them a way to more smoothly tell other people their own stories that can do the heart part of it, the emotional part of it, is what I'm now about to embark on doing. And that's why it's so much fun talking with you, because coincidentally, your left hemisphere is saying your synchronicity is important, but you can't use AI for it, but because it's too left hemisphere. And I'm saying, well, I want to get the master in control of the left hemisphere called AI.
Yeah, I'm not going to claim I understand what you're doing though. I'm not going to say that AI can't do it. I'm just saying that the human operator of providing that prompt and providing that shift to beauty can change the nature of that system. It's again the the biggest misperception of McGilchrist's work, among one of the biggest, is the idea that the left hemisphere is some way bad. It's not. It's just much more limited than it understands. And once we've learned to use it as a tool, the more mystical people from Rick Tarnas that you read, it's like we were supposed to fall. We were supposed to go through this experience of developing this extraordinarily powerful technology, and then like toddlers with Uzis not knowing how to handle it, so that it can then get returned under right hemispheric control. So whichever way you go with the AI, I think it's really good. And actually, even more importantly than that, the reason why I'm so overly left hemispheric now is that my community is small. It's 90 people, half of whom are finance, 30% are tech, and 20% are like glorious healers. And people will not swallow a pill with the wrong coating. But also like I've joined all these spiritual communities to see how horribly ineffective they are, and they're disastrous. And it's
You know why? You know why they're disastrous? Why?
because they have no agency. That they either write 10,000 words on AI safety or climate change and yet don't know anyone in AI safety or climate change. They just write these things for other people that already agree with them to read, or they've never developed any executive function because they've never actually been in the real world. And so when it comes to implementing what they need to implement, they don't do it. Instead, they just invent, ironically, even more abstract words and terminology like metamodernism to feel better than everyone else that's still stuck inside the machine while never actually changing anything. And in contrast, you now have these emerging left hemispheric communities of people with real agency and assets who are starting to understand that there's a there, who are starting to see their own left brain lock, who are starting to see the attractor. But the moment you start talking to them about crystals, you have lost them and they are not coming back. And they are allergic to people without agency. And so my point is we need this middle ground where you have someone like you with a psychiatry background who is not a moron and can talk in the language of science and can cite studies and can cite neurology that can get these people on board. That's part of the reason why Ian McGilchrist is so wonderful, that I've had this conversation 400-500 times with highly rational people. And if you start at the gateway drug of neurology, because everyone's got a brain, and for whatever reason, neurology just gets under the skepticism radar, and then you end up at this attractor idea, people can take this on because it has just enough science. And the reason why I said at the start, McGilchrist's model points to the mystery. It doesn't destroy the mystery. It says, here's something mysterious you're not connected enough to. It doesn't say this is all just brain chemistry, which is the thing I hate about psychiatry, to be honest.
And my approach is not so much data to start with, it's personal experience.
Yeah.
It's finding people who wonder. Your notion, which of course has been around, but I love the way you say it. You need chaos to transform. You got to go through a big thing. You went through a huge thing, and you're still transforming, but you recognized this ain't the way I got to do it. And that allowed you to integrate, to take the differentiated parts of yourself that were scattered all over the place and integrate them into what we have now. And meaningful coincidences do that in small ways and bigger ways to people. And what I'm trying to do is help them make sense, that is left hemisphere, by saying you're not the only one.
Mm.
Other people have these experiences. And a lot of people use them to confirm they're on the right path. But other people use them to indicate how connected we are to people we love in particular. And this China one I'm telling you about is one of several that she and I have, and it just confirms a connection. She had a dream, told me about it, and asked me if this dream might apply to a problem I was having. It did.
Wow.
And what that says is when that works, when it's effective, when it helps, that's an emotional charge. It's information. But then you feel it, and you could feel my feeling of it, I think, when I was just telling you about that. So the left hemisphere has to try to understand it, and the right hemisphere gives the emotion to it. It fills in the gap that the left hemisphere is looking for to try to explain or understand. And that leads me to that kind of simple story happens between lots of people where they makes them feel more connected. It's like calling them on the phone, but you didn't call them. Something else made the connection. So these interconnections are there. They're part of what you are talking about. There's not just your own thread, not just your own beam, but the beams of others who are also walking along or going through this beaming up, who are connecting with each other and don't even know it until sometimes something strange happens, a synchronicity that says, how did that happen? Well, I'm not sure, and I like to guess about that. I have my ideas about how it happens, but that it happens. The
And what you're
base.
doing,
Go ahead.
one of the greatest videos you could check out online is Ceausescu's final speech in Romania, where basically he gets out, he was the communist dictator, he gets out on the balcony, and suddenly people start booing. And you realize that suddenly his unpopularity becomes common knowledge. And common knowledge isn't about everyone knowing something. Common knowledge is about everyone knowing that everyone else knows something.
Yes.
Right? And suddenly there's common knowledge. And I think what you're doing is you're creating common knowledge around synchronicity. I've looked at materialist science and I'm like, if you inject love into every premise, it makes it complete. We're all separate individuals. Yes. And we're all bound by love, this common universal consciousness, right? Survival of the fittest works. Yes, but actually cooperation is a superior evolutionary strategy. If you re-inject love into every single premise of materialist science and actually start to understand that love is itself probably the way the attractor acts on us. One thing I say to people is that the world is combinatorially explosive. There are too many options and too little time. Evolution would have to create a way for us to narrow down our options. And in romantic partners, if you're ever swiping on Tinder, you realize that what you're attracted to and who is attracted back to you is the way that you narrow your options. Information works the same way, that there is information you are attracted to and rewards you for pursuing it through synchronicity because it is evolving you into a niche. It is relational, but we don't even have words for relationality in today's world. And one of my favorite little stats is that Sanskrit has 96 words for love and we have one. We have to use the same word for Labradors as we want to use for people we have sex with, right? Like it's so unbelievably crude that we can't calibrate ourselves in our environment because our conception of the word love is still so flawed. But yeah, like people can use that to navigate in the same way they can use synchronicity and bring people's attention to the fact that this is ubiquitous. Something like 50% of Americans have had a mystical experience. The moment you start talking about it, the people that come out of the woodwork, and there's still this stigma. When I came up on when I went on to this Wall Street speech, I had people coming up to me afterwards from major hedge funds, kind of whispering. I'm like, why are you whispering? And this taboo still exists.
And that's what Mona has a good time doing, talking to scientists about weird stuff, the spirituality, and they come up to her the same way that you're talking about, because there is among the highly rational people a recognition there's something else, but they're not allowed to think it. And I'm a psychiatrist. I get to say what's crazy or not. So that's part of the fun. That's part of the fun of this. I get to do that. This ain't crazy, ladies and gentlemen. Should be common knowledge that meaningful coincidences are part of living on this planet. And I'm still going to, I'm going to use AI as a way of getting it out. One of the ways that we've been doing it is by getting synchronicity groups meeting locally, so that a couple of people in the Coincidence Project are organizing groups where people can talk about meaningful coincidences in person, which is really the far better way of doing it than on doing it online. But the idea I have is get it to be like Ceausescu got people to recognize. I love that you bring it up because I played rugby in Romania under when he was the ruler of the place, and it was a scary place to be in. So it's nice to hear you reference him in Romania as an exemplar of its common knowledge is when you know other people know it. And creating groups that recognize synchronicity is valuable can be accelerated, I think, by helping them see their own coincidences from outside of themselves. And here's somebody helping them see that. And that is making the left hemisphere recognize there's something else going on around here, but not in a big blow up necessarily, but in an incremental way. I love your little experiments idea. Not your idea, of course, and you've made that clear. You use other people's idea, but you integrate them beautifully, Tom. It's really wonderful hearing how you do that, and putting them together. So that synchronicities are a form of those little experiences that if other people know that I'm not the only one, that this is out there. So that's just my job, is to make it what Ceausescu made other people realize, that it's common knowledge that people experience synchronicity.
Yeah, and that brings down a tyranny.
Pardon me?
That brings down a tyranny, but it's a tyranny that's inside of us. You know, the left hemisphere has all of the characteristics of a dictator.
Yes.
It strangles spontaneity. It lies to maintain control. It's the Senex archetype. It's a part of our psyche that used to be very useful, but has now exceeded its usefulness.
It has
And
exceeded, yes, it's
yeah,
exceeded its usefulness. And you are doing the work with a bunch of really tough ones out there in the big city, uh, and and really smart people who've been thoroughly indoctrinated by Western science, by materialistic science, thoroughly indoctrinated. They're so smart, they hold on to it really tightly. And you're going against a big, big obstacle there. And I admire you for doing that. I admire you for doing that.
thank you. But you know, it's not that. It's not what you think. Like, admittedly, like my group is tiny. It's 90 people, and it's all self-selecting because they've heard me. But the time is now. Like, this thing is happening right now. You're doing this at exactly the right time. Like, I'm seeing the cracks everywhere, and there's now just enough science for people to take this seriously, and it's now becoming just popular enough that people take this seriously. McGilchrist is at the vanguard. It's happening. It's going to be messy, but I really feel it's in the next couple of years where this stuff is going to go totally mainstream. And the reason why what I'm doing is important to me is because these are rich and powerful people I'm speaking to. They have agency and they have impact, and they're on a much more positive trajectory than you might think.
Beautiful. Thank you for what you're doing. And it's you. I mean, I'm going to say you, Tom Morgan, but it's not just you. And part of what I'm hoping people will recognize is that you, Tom Morgan, there is a you somewhere in there that is functioning in your left brain. But there's you that's also part of a much bigger process. So to be able for Western people to be able to be both myself and disappeared into something greater is a hard duality for people to go back and forth between. But that's agency and that's connectedness. And you're helping all of us recognize our agency and recognize our connectedness among each other and something greater that we have yet to have words for but can't experience.
Well, thank you. And like, before we get too serious about this, it's really, really fun. Like, the moment you find that niche, that point of differentiation and integration, your life just opens up. And like, my daily life is blissful. And I wanted to kill myself 50 times a day when I was in the dark night, right? Like, my life right now is pretty close to perfect. And it's because I feel like I found that meaningful niche that I've been guided into through synchronicity, right? Like, it's not about me. Like, when you say service and sacrifice to people, they hear the wrong thing. And God knows I tried to do that for years by trying to be a hospice worker and social worker and Jungian analyst, and trying to find these bad niches for myself that felt meaningful. When you find this place that you're supposed to be, everything feels fantastic. And my favorite quote of my entire life from Joseph Campbell: follow your bliss and doors will open where only there were walls.
That's what you've been saying. That's what you've been saying the whole time. And I want I want to also agree with you that it's fun. I mean, I love this fun. I just had a major chaos thing happen with the coincidence project that I've had to learn about, but I like that, even though it teaches me that even that and the painfulness and the emotional tax it has been taken on me is still part of this fun of it. It's just kind of amusing to have to go through this turmoil and see what comes out on the other side, because I try to look at the other people who are making this impact on me and say, what is it that you're seeing about me that is making this happen? So I get to see mirrors of myself that I might not be able to see. So that's part of the fun too. And I would ask you, and I think you would agree with this, that my being able to compliment you is fun. I-
It's not fun for me. I'm British. I can't take compliments. It makes me incredibly awkward.
Get over yourself, baby. Get over yourself. So one of your lessons coming out of this is be able to take a compliment from Bernie, which you just got. I know it's hard. I know the problem, and I'm not British. I know the problem. It's harder for you, but you got it. Being able to take a compliment, as simple as you know this, really, in words, you know this, but be able to emotionally let your left brain loosen up and let your right brain together with your left brain be happy with the idea that this guy who that's you probably respect, is saying, hey, baby, you're doing some good stuff here.
Well, it goes back to what you're doing, right? Which is that I think people have find it. Some people find it quite easy to give love. People find it very, very hard to receive love. And if you can't receive love, you can't understand that the environment you inhabit is fundamentally loving towards you, which is another reason why you can't accept synchronicity, because you just can't receive the signals that you'll need to, with the idea that those signals are meant benignly.
Let's end with that lovely statement. Let's end with that. Tom, thank you very, very much for talking with me. This has been great. I'm glad we had a dialogue. Some people just like to talk, and you like to interact, and I very, very much appreciate being able to talk with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
This psychosphere is our mental atmosphere, like a hologram of cosmic consciousness.